Last session, we talked about Mark's two halves. And in dealing with that, Mark really neatly divides just about in the middle of the book. And in the first half of Mark's gospel, Jesus is portrayed as a very powerful figure. There are all sorts of miracle stories. Most of it occurs in Galilee and some surrounding areas. In the second half of the book, things shift radically, in which the focus is on Jesus as powerless, becoming increasingly so, and eventually to the point of his suffering and death. Miracle activity continues in that second half, in the very first part of the second half, but it gets harder. And we find taking more effort, more tries to accomplish what had occurred. And the entire move of the second half is toward Jerusalem. And so basically the whole movement is Jesus and his followers on their way to Jerusalem, where he ends up being crucified. The middle point for this is the story that's often called the Confession of Peter, and I think it's a rotten title for that, but at that point in chapter 8, Peter responds to Jesus asking, "Who do you say that I am?" In which he asks his followers, and Peter, responding for the group, says, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one." And Jesus responds, "Don't tell anyone." Now that's a strange kind of thing to have happen. But what I had pointed out last time was that contrary to many sermons that I have heard in my lifetime about that particular passage, in which the person doing the preaching has said, "At last, Jesus has been trying to tell people who he is and trying to convince them of who he is, and now at last Peter has finally gotten it." Wrong. Jesus has said nothing about being Messiah. Jesus has not focused on himself, on identity. That simply is not something that Mark talks about. In the very first verse of Mark's gospel, the beginning of the gospel or the good news of Jesus, Messiah, or Jesus Christ, the word appears there, and very clearly Mark thinks that the term Messiah is an appropriate term to apply to Jesus. But from that, "Don't tell anyone," it's very clear that something is wrong. Okay, the title Messiah can be used and applied to Jesus, but apparently there are different ways of understanding that. And we have Mark's gospel presenting Jesus as really shutting down any kind of speculation about identity. Mark isn't an identity kind of gospel. And as we look at this overall structure of Mark's gospel and the announcement at the very beginning of the good news of Jesus, Messiah, well, a story that moves from Jesus being powerful, doing a lot of miracles, to getting killed. That really doesn't sound like a typical success story. And it's really important to recognize that in Mark's gospel, Jesus' crucifixion, his death, is the most important event in this gospel. No, it is not resurrection. Resurrection is affirmed, but we have to ask, what does that mean? And we also have to recognize that in Mark's gospel, when resurrection is talked about, it is not talked about in spectacular kinds of terms. It's, and remembering that Mark's gospel, the original ending was chapter 16, verse 8, in which the women flee from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. The end. There are no resurrection appearance stories. Okay, that's it. So, what does good news mean? Good news for whom? And as we look at the things this evening and look at what's going on with apparently with Mark's original audience, we really need to be asking, how is this good news? We also, as we look at this material, we need to keep recognizing that perhaps we are not going to be real enthusiasts of what Mark is doing with his original audience, because our situation is not the situation of the original audience. But I would suggest that there are a whole lot of things that we can learn from that, from what Mark is doing. And in many respects, one of the things that we can learn is that there are more ways of thinking about Jesus. There are more ways of thinking about the significance of Jesus than the rather narrowed set of views that eventually end up getting presented within Christianity. And one of the things that I'm just very excited about in dealing with biblical materials is that it blows apart the kind of framework that we've often used, and we start seeing, hey, the way that Christianity, the bulk of Christianity, came to think about Jesus was not an inevitable kind of move. There were different kinds of options that were taken, and in Mark's gospel, we get a glimpse of some of the ways not taken, the paths not taken by subsequent Christianity. And for me as a person who loves grubbing around in this stuff, that's a rather exciting thing for me. As we looked last week, we spent a good deal of time looking at miracle stories as a whole, but especially this set of sea stories and feedings, which very often are stories that are presented as being nature miracles. Okay, things that in some ways often get presented as being especially spectacular. But these stories have some really odd features to them. For example, in the sea stories, the stilling of the storm and the sea walk, surprisingly, Mark portrays Jesus as apparently thinking that his followers really don't need to be rescued. They can handle this situation. Jesus is ticked when they wake him up during the midst of a storm. The boat's filling up, and once he has awakened, has stilled the storm, Jesus' question to the disciples is, "Why are you cowards?" Apparently, he didn't think it was necessary to awaken him. They could handle this. Now, this doesn't mean that they would necessarily survive, but they could handle it. They could handle it faithfully. They could handle it as people of faith. And no, they didn't need to be rescued. Their need, their own felt need to be rescued, that's indicative of something going on in their heads that ends up creating other kinds of problems that we can see occurring as we look further at the situation of Mark's community. The sea walk. The explicit statement in there, when Jesus comes walking on the sea, he intended to pass them by. Hi, guys. Keeps on walking. And in that situation is less dire than the previous sea story. But no, that's often not recognized in these stories. In the feeding stories, Jesus is explicit in saying to the disciples, you yourselves feed them. And we start getting some hints with some rather strange comments in these stories that we've apparently missed something when we read through the stories. At the end of the Sea Walk story, it says that they did not understand about the loaves. What does that have to do with the Sea Walk story? And clearly we missed something in the feeding story, feeding of the 5,000 story. When we get to the feeding of the 4,000, and the Gospel of Mark clearly signals that, hey, the reader, the audience, needs to connect the feeding of the 4,000 with the feeding of the 5,000. When again, there was a great crowd with nothing to eat. Yes, okay. When again, the author is pointing us to connecting those stories. And we go through the whole process, and the disciples still don't seem to understand what's going on. We then have another story. We've had sea stories, we've had feeding stories. We get a feeding and sea story combined here, in which the underscoring of the 12 as blind, uncomprehending, unperceptive. That's a very important thing. And as we think back through the stories, we suddenly realize that, hey, the disciples have never seen any kind of miracle in the feeding. When in the feeding of the 4,000, when Jesus, after 3 days, brings up the fact, hey, got a lot of people here, don't have anything to eat. The disciples' response is, how could anyone feed all these people here in the wilderness? Even though, that had happened 2 chapters before. They hadn't seen anything. And yet, as the story is told, apparently the feeding occurs through them sharing things. As I mentioned last time, it's not Jesus breaking bread and creating this big mound that they then keep shoveling out, in which everybody can see this. But no, it's simply during the distribution that people get fed. And that's a really important kind of thing to see going on. You yourselves feed them. And they did, and they didn't recognize it. In the sequence of stories, the disciples are being criticized. They don't see, they don't hear, they don't understand. And that results in the reader recognizing that, oh, from Mark's perspective, everything is going downhill with respect to the 12. And that goes downhill at the same time that Mark keeps presenting Jesus as getting less powerful. And there's probably a connection between those two, that the more Jesus is less powerful, the less the 12 are interested, the more problems they have in dealing with him. When we move into the second half of the gospel, we see that in chapters 8 through 10, it's very carefully organized. We have Peter's confession, "You are the Messiah," followed by this threefold set of passion predictions, in which after each passion prediction, there's a misunderstanding by one or more of the 12. And then Jesus attempts to clarify. And during the last couple weeks here at Countryside, we've had a chance during our sermons on Sunday morning to be dealing with the first two of those passion predictions and misunderstandings that occurred. And in the first of those misunderstandings, Peter insists that Jesus is not going to die. He's not going to suffer and die. That simply cannot happen. And Peter is dealing with, he's feeding off the first half of the gospel. He has a particular understanding of what it means to be Messiah. It means to be a figure of power. And the idea of suffering and dying simply has no place in his understanding. And we have Jesus pointing out that, okay, what's going on with Jesus here in suffering and dying is closely connected with what's going to be occurring with respect to Jesus' followers. If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the good news will save it. To put it somewhat bluntly, for subsequent Christians who follow Jesus because they want to go to heaven, those are precisely the people who don't deserve it. That really, that's not understanding what's going on. It's a self-centered kind of perspective. And the wordplay with saving life, losing it. There are different ways of being able to understand that. There's an 8th century Sufi Muslim mystic, female, Rabia al-Basri. And I love this particular quote. If I adore you out of fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I adore you out of desire for paradise, lock me out of paradise. But if I adore you for yourself alone, do not deny to me your eternal beauty. If self-interest, if self-promotion is what you're looking for out of religion, Rabia and Mark are saying, no, that's really not what's going on here. That's really not the heart of what is occurring. And there are multiple other instances one can take from other world religions. Buddhism has very much the same kind of teaching. Hinduism has very much the same kind of teaching. You can find, We've got it in Islam here. You can find it in Judaism. Self-centeredness is not what religion, what a relationship with God is about. And yet it's so easy to fall into that particular kind of trap. After the second passion prediction, the misunderstanding was one of the Jesus followers arguing about who's the greatest. Jesus is talking about going to suffer, he's going to suffer and die. And they're concerned about which one of them is the greatest. And the kind of clarification that Jesus provides. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. He takes a child, puts it among them. It says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. I think this last sentence is one of the most important sentences in the Gospels. And you will find very similar statement, very similar formulation to this in the Gospel of John as well, in which being able to look at something or look at someone and see something else. Okay, that's a key part of what, if you will, eyes of faith are about. That's a key aspect of what the mystery of the kingdom of God is. Being able to look at one thing, one set of circumstances, and yet see that, understand that in a very different kind of way. In the third the third passion prediction and misunderstanding, James and John come up and hand Jesus a blank check, in effect. We want you to do whatever we ask of you. And Jesus says, what do you want? And said, to be seated one at your right hand, one at your left. And Jesus responds, you don't know what you're asking for. And it's striking as Mark's story continues to develop. When's the next place that comments about one on the right, one on the left get talked about? Yes, at Jesus' execution. And in the conversation, that there are double sets of meanings as you go through. Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? Yep. Can you drink the cup that I will drink? Yep. Jesus says, yeah, you will. But it's not mine to be positioning people next to me. With this, the death imagery that is present is really very, very, very profound. And if we take a look at the Gethsemane scene, take this cup from me. That's an important thing. Baptism, something that it's the first thing we see with Jesus, and it's in baptism that he gets called, that he gets empowered, and yet his empowering, he's immediately thrown into the wilderness, cast into the wilderness. It's not a move into great things for oneself. And for Mark, whatever is true for Jesus is also true for Jesus' followers. Those things go together. The final this misunderstanding and clarification then ends up in this way. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it's not to be so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. In the Gospel of Mark, this is basically the only statement that talks about a positive feature of Jesus dying. And this particular saying has ended up getting interpreted in particular kinds of ways that have very little connection with the rest of what Mark's gospel is doing. When we have Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. The term ransom, what have you heard in terms of the use of that particular word? Okay. In our culture, we hear kidnapping and paying a bunch of money or some such thing, bunch of money in a getaway car is what they want in order to let the person who's been kidnapped go free. What else? Okay, there is a whole strand of Christian theology that basically took this verse and used it to create a whole system for talking about why Jesus had to die. He took my place. And Jesus provides the ransom so that somebody else doesn't experience the consequences of one's sins or what have you. And that's a very, very frequent way that people understand that. And in that, it often gets pulled into a whole sacrificial theology kind of thing. What's striking, though, is that this term is not from the sacrificial system. The term comes from the slave market. It's basic. A ransom is the term that the Greek word used here is the term that's used for anything that provides freedom to a slave. And it could be someone purchasing another person's freedom. It might be a particular action that's done that makes it possible for a slave to be freed. But it raises certain questions. Freed from what? Freed for what? Well, amazingly, Mark doesn't say. But it's also important to recognize that for Mark, it is not something in which the ransom is not something that deals with sin kinds of categories. Think back to our very first session in which Jesus receives a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus receives that. A bunch of other folks do. And hey, it works. There isn't one bit of criticism about what John the Baptizer was proclaiming. Jesus becomes part of that. All sorts of other people become part of that. Later on in Mark's gospel, we have uh, we have a an encounter between Jesus and some temple officials in which Jesus asks them, what was the authority that John the Baptizer had for what he was doing? People getting freed from their sins. Was it from humans or was that from heaven, from God? And Mark presents the deliberations of the religious authorities saying, well, if we say this, that's going to lead to this. But if we say this other thing, and we're going to be caught. And they end up saying, I don't know. But with this, the striking feature is that there is no criticism of the ability for people to be forgiven in John's activity of baptizing people. That's accepted. There's no problem in Jesus healing a person and saying, your sins are forgiven. And your sins are forgiven in this particular case, and we're going to look more at that passage this next session. It's not something that only Jesus is able to do. It's something that human beings can do in forgiving other people. And you don't need Jesus to die in order for people to be forgiven. God's been doing that kind of stuff a long, long time. And it's important in understanding Mark's gospel to keep those channels open in terms of understanding things rather than going down the rabbit holes that have often occurred. Back here for just a moment. When it says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. We find that real power in Mark's gospel is a matter of serving other people. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. And what's true for Jesus is true for other people too. That's what they are to do. That's how they experience, that's how they exercise power. And yes, in Mark's gospel, even dying is a way of serving others. In our own national story, we very frequently talk about people giving their lives in the service of the country. That yes, it's possible to die and be serving at the same time. Back in the first half of the gospel, when Jesus is doing all sorts of spectacular things, the key thing he's doing is serving other people. In the second half of the gospel, he is serving other people. And thus, one modification on this chart is to say, okay, in the beginning of the first half of the gospel, Jesus is apparently powerful there. He's apparently powerless here, but real power runs all the way through. That's a key element to have that. So as we look at material here, we find that Mark has provided a critique of the 12. They view Jesus as primarily a rescuer, someone who's got to be a winner. rather than being a model of what they themselves need to be. Their approach is that Jesus does stuff, so we don't need to. And that has become a major theme in much of Christianity. He does this, so I don't have to. Jesus paid it all. That's a problem. The 12 are clueless. They're deaf, they're blind, they don't understand. They're interested in personal power, privilege, prestige, status, ease. The Gospel of Mark, contrary to the way in which we often think of things, the 12, Gospel of Mark presents the 12 as negative examples. The 12 are not models to be followed in Mark's Gospel. Never. The 12 do what Jesus' followers should not do. Followers of Jesus should do what Jesus does, and to do that regardless of the outcome that occurs. After this whole series of misunderstandings and seeing this kind of bookended by these healings of blind men, the first blind man healed back in chapter 8, he claims to see, but he doesn't. I see people that look like trees walking. Oops. In this latter story, we have a blind person highlighting compassion. Jesus, Son of David, have compassion on me. Son of David, have compassion on me. And please note, this is a very non-kingly kind of thing that is being highlighted here. Verse 51, same question that Jesus asked James and John. What do you want me to do for you? Rabboni, let me see again. Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well. Okay. Previous healing of blind man takes 2 tries to get it done. It's a difficult thing to deal with. But the role of faith, of being able to see, to perceive, is important. And this final phrase, the blind man follows Jesus on the way to the cross. Remember, way is a major theme in Mark's Gospel. Your faith has made you well, followed him on the way, and that then leads into the whole passion story, the story of Jesus' suffering and death. Mark's story of Jesus presents Jesus' ministry as taking less than a year. There's absolutely nothing in Mark's Gospel that requires more than just a few months. A third of the Gospel of Mark deals with just the week before Jesus' crucifixion. Yeah. Mark has often been labeled as a passion story, the story of Jesus' suffering and death, with an extended introduction. And I think that's a really good description of Mark. And recognize that in Mark's Gospel, Jesus' suffering and death, that's the very most important set of events that occurs. Tonight, in our remaining time, I want to focus on Mark's original audience. as you've looked at the Gospel of Mark, what kind of hints have you seen about anything that we could learn about the original audience of Mark's Gospel? Whom Mark is writing this thing for? It's not a to whom it may concern sort of thing. Mark has a very specific kind of situation that is being addressed. Anything that strikes you of what's popped up?
Seems to me we have to be a rather literate group, sophisticated intellectually.
For what reason?
There's so much subtlety to it that it's easy to focus on the exciting, the dramatic, without understanding the meaning behind it.
Okay. And I mean, I think Mark's storytelling is amazing. For a long time, the Gospel of Mark was kind of poo-pooed as really not being very sophisticated. It was often described as being just a bunch of individual stories that were kind of strung together on a string, like so many beads or pieces of popcorn or something. And there wasn't much sophistication that was seen. But in the last 50 years, so there's been a huge emphasis on the sophistication of Mark's storytelling. But we perhaps should be careful about distinguishing between storytelling and educational level. Traditional cultures specialize in storytelling. Okay, that's how cultures have passed on their key values, so on. And in the Gospel of Mark is written in order, apparently, to be read aloud to a group of people. You didn't have printing presses, okay? The primary way that people would have encountered this gospel, or frankly, any piece of literature, was by having someone read it aloud to the group. And, with this story, you may not catch everything first time through. I mean, when you're listening to a story, you can't stop and back up a few pages and check things out. No, the story just keeps on going. But presumably, it gets told over and over and over again. And in that process, a lot of the things that don't get recognized first time through, you start recognizing things that, gee, I didn't see that before. And every time we see that, it complicates our way of understanding the story. And as we talked about the first session, we as audience, we end up creating certain kinds of expectations. We fill in the gaps in certain kinds of ways. We've built the story. I mean, we're the ones creating the story from Mark's words, and we can build it in multiple directions. But the story itself ends up having some power over us and saying, well, if we go down that path, we suddenly hit this roadblock. And we got to back up and say, oh, let's get down this path. Same as in mystery novels. Who done it? You keep changing. So, I mean, I appreciate the comment about, yes, Mark's gospel requires some sophistication, but I'm not sure it's educational sophistication that it's there. It's story sense and being able to deal with some of that. Now, we should also be careful about whether some of the things that we battle in reading Gospel of Mark, some of those battles are things that got decided a few hundred years after the time Mark wrote. And if we kind of wipe away some of that and let Mark's story speak for itself, there may be an easier way with that. Anything else? Well, the audience is apparently Greek speaking. The thing's written in Greek. There are some places, and they don't know Aramaic. There are a number of Aramaic words and sometimes brief sentences that occur that are quoted, but very often Gospel of Mark provides a translation for those. So apparently the audience primarily speaks Greek. They need some help with Aramaic. It's a Gentile gospel. The audience seems to be Gentile, not from Jewish background, because there are a number of places where the narrator goes out of his or her way to explain particular Jewish practices. That'd be totally unnecessary, a waste of good writing resources, if in fact the audience was expected to know those things. Apparently the audience is a Christian audience, rather than this being a missionary document. It's assuming some knowledge of things. And as we go through things, it appears that Mark is trying to change something in the audience, particular ways of behaving, particular ways of thinking, particular attitudes, and next week we'll explore that a little more. One of the biggest elements is that Mark's audience seems to be experiencing suffering in some form. Okay, why do I say that? In chapter 8, when the very first misunderstanding that we have Peter having, no, you can't have any suffering occur. And Mark's gospel picks up the importance of suffering on the part of Jesus' followers. Now, why would you include that if the audience wasn't suffering in some sort of way? And we can start trying to fill in, is it that they think their suffering may mean that they're going about this whole thing wrong? Does their suffering mean that they've screwed up in following Jesus or serving God? There are a number of things that pick up that kind of element. We see, and I'm going to bring up another thing and then come back to the suffering thing. It seems to be impacted by the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. There's a lot of stuff about the destruction of the temple. And in chapters 11 to 13, when Jesus enters Jerusalem, he first goes to the temple and kind of checks things out, then he goes out of the city. Next day, heads to the temple again. And we have a rather strange set of stories here in which there's a cursing of a fig tree, and then there's Jesus kind of running amok within the temple, creating a real disturbance. And then, they leave the city again. Next morning, we're back to the fig tree again. And this is a writing technique that Mark uses of taking a story, kind of pulling it apart, ramming something else in between, creating a sandwich, in effect, in which the buns influence how you understand the stuff in the middle, and the stuff in the middle influence how you understand the buns, okay, in this sandwich. The cursing of the fig tree and the temple ruckus seems to be dealing with destruction of the temple. And if you look at the end of this whole section, we have in chapter 13 very explicit kinds of material talking about the destruction of the temple. Verse 2. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. The beginning of the birth pangs. As for yourselves, beware, for they'll hand you over to the councils, and you'll be beaten in the synagogues, and you'll stand before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all Gentiles. When they bring you to trial and hand you over, don't worry beforehand about what you're to say, but say whatever is given to you at that time, for it's not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Sibling will betray sibling to death, and a father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. You'll be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, this is presented in this very apocalyptic kind of prediction type of thing. But it appears that what is presented as prediction here is a good description of what Mark's audience is in fact experiencing. What is presented as Jesus predicting something, oh, that's what we're experiencing 40 years later. In 70 CE, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed. This is from the Arch of Titus in Rome that commemorates Rome's destruction of the temple. You see menorah from the temple being carted away by Roman troops. What Mark is doing is connecting two different time points: Jesus' ministry and the destruction of Jesus, and the destruction of the temple, and is viewing those as being connected in some way, suggesting that Mark's story of Jesus is told to help the audience deal with their own situation of suffering. I want to jump to the, oops, no, I don't want to jump. No jumping allowed. No, take that back. I'd like us to look at the story of Jesus' crucifixion and just the crucifixion material and the events leading up to it. And at the point that I stop, okay, I'm going to read this material in a way that you're probably not accustomed to hearing it read. And I want to unpack why I do it that way. Let's start at verse 22 here. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two rebels, or two revolutionaries, two insurrectionists, one on his right and one on his left. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was ripped in two from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, ha, truly this person was a son of God. Sarcasm. I expect most of you have heard that truly this person was the Son of God. We'll come back to that in a minute. The only thing that marks Jesus says from the cross in Mark's gospel is, my God, why have you abandoned me? In ancient cultures, as frankly in our culture, a person's last words often take on a rather large significance. They get treasured, or they become really disturbing. But the last thing that a person says is often viewed as somehow wrapping up that person's life, summarizing the person's life. And for Jesus to have his life summarized by, my God, why have you abandoned me? That's probably not the way most Christians have tended to think about Jesus.
Referring to disciples and apostles, he referring to those who abandoned him were his apostles, his followers.
His followers have indeed abandoned him. And in fact, almost 2 chapters earlier, they abandoned him. In the Gospel of Mark, the 12 are nowhere to be found. They disappear in chapter 14, and they never make an appearance again. They're referred to at one point in a hopeful kind of way, but that hope then gets dashed by the end of the paragraph. My God, why have you abandoned me? Okay. Is that a statement that you expect that a person of faith would make? Or does that sound like something that a person of no faith would make?
If they had no faith, why would they be talking to them?
Okay. And a number of people have picked that kind of thing up. My God. Okay, it's a prayer addressed to God.
If we're looking at context, this man's been hanging on a cross for 6 hours.
Yeah.
It's probably in pretty rough shape. I mean, it'd be
Safe bet.
hard to have a faithful thing to say at that point.
Although you will find that Other gospels have no problem coming up with rosier statements. But yeah, for Mark, that's
Really fascinated by your, where you're putting this together. This is really hard, but is there in your mind this connection between that statement and the disciples back in the boat?
I think there is a connection. Yep. I'm not going to say much more about that at this point, but yes, I think there is. When things really become rough, it's a rather natural thing to blame God. I mean, I've encountered plenty of people that you know, losing a job, death occurs, having some sort of illness. There's a lot of stuff, and I recall in my first year as a pastor, one of the really disturbing experiences I had was going into a hospital room. Man and his wife are there in the room. Man's in the hospital bed, and spent some time with him. And the point that I was ready to leave, I asked, as I often did, "Would you like me to say a prayer with you?" And he said very quickly, "Yes, I want you to pray that I die." Whoa. I don't recall any pastoral care classes preparing me for that particular moment. But I mean, there are surprising things that often occur. And you know, Sherman Tureen stretched me that day in good shape, as I needed to rethink, okay, what it means to be a person of faith. And Sherman was by golly, a really solid person of faith. And his wife, when he said, "I want you to pray that I die," she's nodding her head in agreement. It's clear that the two of them had talked about this. And yes, what, it kind of went against the grain for me to think that you're giving up. No, you got to keep going. But no, being a person of faith contains a whole lot more options than we often imagine. Connie.
You know, wanting to die doesn't mean you've given up faith.
Correct. That is very true. And that was the tough lesson that I needed to be jolted into. Yes. Now, this goes another step beyond. Why have you abandoned me? This particular statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me?" This statement is also found in the Hebrew Bible. It's the first line of Psalm 22. And within the Psalms, there are a whole category called laments or complaints, Psalms of lament, Psalms of complaint. And Psalm 22 basically rips God up one side and down the other, complaining about the horrible things that are going on. And some have said, well, what this means is that it just means Jesus quoted Psalm 22. And could be. The persons who give that explanation often rely on the fact that, okay, all of this complaint language occurs in the first part of the psalm, and it ends by praising God. And saying, well, this is just a little misleading. Well, Mark, whoever he or she may be, has chosen to use that first line to emphasize that aspect rather than quoting something later on, praising God. And if we look at Mark's story of the crucifixion of Jesus, we will find that there are a whole bunch of phrases throughout the description of the crucifixion that have been borrowed from various psalms of lament. Psalms of lament were things that in Judaism and within early Christianity were used as a way of giving voice to one's own foul mood, one's own complaints. Sometimes you're just so crushed you don't have words to speak. Had the most profound use of psalms that I've ever encountered in my life with a person in a congregation. They had a high school age daughter who was really their pride and joy. And one Saturday night, there was doorbell ring, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they learned that their daughter had been hit by a drunk driver, had died. And this couple spent the rest of that night in their living room reading the Psalms back and forth to one another, starting at the beginning, continuing on through. And the book of Psalms has all sorts of glorious praise kinds of things, and it has horrible complaints against God. I mean, the entire spectrum of human emotion gets covered with that. And as they read that material, they were able to give thanks for their daughter and complain bitterly and angrily about the person who had killed her. And yeah, that's the kind of thing that occurs. And my God, why have you abandoned me? It's a perfectly healthy thing to be saying. To recognize that Mark tells the story of Jesus' death using materials that that I expect had been used by people in Mark's community in similar kinds of situations, in their own suffering. And thus, as they hear those things that they're familiar with in their own faith life, dealing with life's ups and downs, they see within the story of Jesus' death their own suffering, their own questions, their own concern. So I expect that in Mark's presenting Jesus as saying, my God, why have you abandoned me? I expect there were people in Mark's audience that could say, now there's somebody who knows what's going on. There's somebody who understands what I'm experiencing. What's striking is that we then have the centurion's response. And it's a response to that statement. Truly, this person was a son of God. Yeah, right. Is this an expression of religious affirmation, or is it sarcastic mockery? And in order to deal with that, try to sort this through, well, what does the text say? Now, what I've got up there at the top is, in fact, what Mark's gospel says in Greek. I mean, this is a translation, literal translation of the Greek. Most English translations say, truly, this person was the Son of God. The is not there.
Yeah. Article, critical.
Yep. So, no. If the was there, if the definite article was there, it would be easier to say, yes, it's a religious affirmation. It's more difficult. This person was a son of, and it is the word, this human, anthropos, this human, son of God. How does Mark describe other people's reactions at the cross? This is describing some of the passers-by and others gathered at the crucifixion. Those who passed by blasphemed him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Everybody that Mark describes at the cross is mocking Jesus. And I suggest that if that's the way he's presenting this, when he then presents the centurion speaking, it would seem most natural to have that also be an expression of mockery. This is we'll in next session pick up some of the things of the trial before the Sanhedrin, but a lot of these themes are being picked up from that. Oh, just a minute. I want to pick up the immediate context of the saying here. Sorry. We have this loud cry. And notice loud cry gets repeated. And the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way, with a loud cry, namely with that cry, breathed his last. He said, "Truly, truly, this person was a son of God." Think through when you last, or what would occur if you heard somebody scream, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Would the first thing that popped into your mind be, truly, this person was Son of God? It makes a whole lot more sense within its context if it's a sarcastic kind of statement.
Yeah, but the curtain was ripped. There was this big message from God right there.
On the other side of the city, yeah. And this is an important.
I like that Jesus Christ superstar version.
Music is great,
I,
This,
Mark has woven a number of things together, but yes, the curtain of the temple, okay, yes, which is a long way away and facing the other direction. So,
So Mark is taking license by putting it in this part.
oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, Mark is taking license in virtually every sentence.
Sure.
No, this is not, as indicated in our first sentence, this is not eyewitness testimony. This is Mark putting together some important kinds of things. But I mean, what you're saying, this is an important part of Mark's communication to the reader. But this is an important part of communication to the reader as well. And I'm going to follow up on that in just a moment, but let me pick up what Son of God mean to a Roman military officer.
Caesar.
This is a coin of Caesar Augustus, the person who was emperor when Jesus was born. Divi Filius, okay, Son of God. This is his son, Tiberius Caesar. And again, Divi, and here we have the F is picked up in that as well. Son of God. A son of God is a person of power, a person who controls it all, a person who calls the shots, a person who is victorious. And for a Roman centurion to watch somebody scream, my God, why have you forsaken me? That certainly does not measure up to what a military officer would think Son of God should be. Going back to the other people at the cross. Temple authorities think that they are mocking Jesus when they call him Messiah, when they call him Son of the Blessed One. That's from his trial scene. When they refer to him as a Davidic king, when they call him King of the Jews, they're mocking the hell out of him. Because he obviously is not an actual political ruler. There's nothing that fits in terms of being a king. And yes, Messiah is king language, as is, by the way, Son of the Blessed One, which we'll talk about more next session. Okay, the temple authorities think that they're mocking Jesus. The Gospel of Mark, however, views those temple authorities as being unwittingly correct in calling Jesus a Messiah, an anointed one, a king. But Jesus' anointing was in preparation for his death and burial. His very different kingship occurs especially through his dying. There's a different definition being employed of Messiah at that point. Just as the centurion thinks he's mocking Jesus as someone who cannot possibly be a son of God because he's not like the emperor. But Mark views the centurion's mockery as unwittingly correct. That yes, Jesus is a son of God in a very different way, and especially through his dying. Now, in Mark's gospel, there has been this secrecy theme running all the way through. And all of the shut up, don't tell anyone kind of language has been underscoring for the reader, the audience of Mark's gospel, that Jesus cannot be understood on the basis of his miracles, his powerful acts. If you look there, if you read just the first half of the gospel, you know nothing about what it means for Jesus. Or what Jesus is, who Jesus is, what Jesus' importance is. When you encounter titles of honor, Messiah, Son of God, you cannot understand Jesus on the basis of those. Don't tell anyone, because if you tell someone about those things, you're passing on incorrect information. It is only after you have Jesus crucified that you are then in a position for starting to understand what it means to talk about what Jesus is all about.
Is that what you're going to address next time?
I am.
I don't think there's enough time tonight.
Oh, drat. Jesus can be understood only in connection with his death. Yet, in contrast to what has often been said within much of Christianity, Mark knows nothing, says nothing about Jesus' death as a sacrifice for sin, or that Jesus' death is the only way that humanity can receive God's forgiveness. Those kinds of ideas are completely alien from this gospel. That still leaves us with the problem, though, of what is it? And fortunately, we've got another session to be able to deal with those things. Hey, that's the whole point. That's right. We've got 5 minutes left. And let's deal with whatever other kinds of questions, comments, disagreements.
I can't imagine that the audience of the time could have gotten out of the gospel what we've gotten in the last 3 sessions. Or at least what I've gotten, what I've gotten.
Okay, and that's a fair kind of question to ask. Okay, am I being too clever for what's really going on here?
I didn't say that.
No, but I am. And I mean that's always a fair kind of question. But okay, I'm suggesting that the problems that I've pointed out and the differences from how things have usually been talked about, that those problems are real. And I think, and this is my claim that all comes down to 2 weeks from tonight, that there is a way of pulling this together that makes sense for a group of people who understand their very existence to be about ready to be wiped out. And go ahead, Don.
I would like for you to speak more about that connection between a Greek-speaking community and the practical experience of the temple, which is there and the Greek-speaking community is here.
Mhm.
Tie them together.
A big question is where this Greek-speaking community is. Traditionally, people tried understanding the Gospel of Mark in relationship to a second century tradition that talked about Mark being the interpreter, the translator for Peter. While Peter was preaching in Rome and saw Rome as being the location where things occur, where the audience existed, and the persecutions that occurred during the time of Nero. Unfortunately, fortunately for my interpretation, Nero's persecutions occurred prior by several years prior to the destruction of the temple. And the repeated emphasis upon the destruction of the temple, I think, can only be connected somewhere else. People who were impacted by at least the chaos that occurred after that. And I'm envisioning someone either in the Decapolis, okay, and by the way, the Decapolis, this is on the east side of the Jordan River. Jerusalem is on the west side, up in the hills. But the Decapolis, even the term, it means 10 cities in Greek. Decapolis is a Greek word. Decapolis was talking about a batch of Greek-speaking cities that occurred in that area. We also have some of that kind of thing occurring in the Galilee area. We also have some of that in southern part of Syria. And when the temple was destroyed in 70, and from 66 to 73, when you have the Jewish revolt against Rome, refugees from Jerusalem, the surrounding area, fled into these other areas. And they were heavily impacted by those. There was Roman presence in those areas. And so I'm envisioning some Greek-speaking people who are relatively close, geographically speaking, to Jerusalem. No, they're not. And one of the striking features of archaeological work that has been done in these areas is that there certainly were some Jews in that area, and a lot of the refugees were Jews, but a lot of refugees were not particularly well cared for in these Gentile areas either. And we have the Jesus movement having already started to expand into other areas. This is after the time of Paul's ministry. And one of the things that I think is going on in the Gospel of Mark is that I think Mark has been influenced in a number of ways by a number of things in Paul's own understandings. And I'll mention some of those next round as well. But simply the chaos of war and post-war kinds of situations, and the cleanup operations that are occurring by Roman troops, etc. I'm envisioning those kinds of circumstances to be what's involved with this. We'll explore that a little bit more next time. By golly, we're out of time. Thank you very much for being here. Next time, what I want to do is look at some of these terms like Messiah, Son of God. I want to take a look at how these terms, oh, and also the term Son of Man, how these terms are used in Mark's gospel. There is a really, really, really strange distribution of this material. And the distribution of those titles is I think, a good indication of what Mark is about in terms of reconceptualizing the meaning of those terms. And I'm going to be suggesting that some of these terms are also being applied to followers of Jesus, okay, including 40 years later at the time of the destruction of the temple, that Son of God, for example, that's something that can make an awfully lot of sense in terms of Jesus followers, not just Jesus. The Apostle Paul speaks heavily, using identically the same term, Son of God, for followers of Jesus. And we'll try connecting some of those things this next round. But it's 2 weeks from tonight. Next week, we have an event here at the church that I hope you will attend, involving Valerie Kaur. She is a person who's part of the Sikh religion, Sikhism, and it's Sikhism is an absolutely fascinating religion, and the message that she is sharing with her revolutionary love bus tour, I think this will be a good experience for us all to be sharing. So see you next round.